You were never anything more than a glorified handyman, Dean, and everyone in this room finally sees it. In front of 300 employees, CEO Vanessa Sinclair fired Dean Foster, a single father whose badge read nothing but technical consultant. Dean did not argue. He carried his box out into the rain, stopped at the recycling bin by the loading dock, and lifted out a framed photo someone had thrown away, a young Dean beside a welder standing in front of their very first machine. Then he pulled out his phone, called a woman named Ruth Bennett, and said 4 words: "Fire all of them." Vanessa thought she had just erased the only man who could stop her $900 million sale. She had no idea those 4 words were a signal she was never meant to hear, or that she now had 6 hours left before everything she thought was hers came apart in a single room. So who is Dean Foster really? Before the walkout even begins, if you haven't yet, tap subscribe and turn on notifications, because this is exactly the kind of story you don't want to miss the ending of. Here's how Dean Foster took his company back. Dean Foster measured his mornings by pancakes shaped like dinosaurs. Every weekday at 6:45, he stood in the kitchen of his small house on the edge of Detroit, pouring batter into a skillet, while his 5-year-old son Eli sat on the counter stool announcing which dinosaur he wanted that day. Grace had been gone 4 years now, taken by an illness that moved faster than anyone expected. In the space she left behind, Dean had rebuilt his whole life around 2 numbers: getting Eli to school by 8 and being home again by 3:15. Nothing about those hours looked like the life of a man who owned 62% of a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. At Foster Precision Group, the aerospace and medical device manufacturer his father, George Edward Foster, had started decades earlier in a rented garage. Dean was known only as the quiet consultant in the canvas jacket. He walked the production floor, checking tolerances on machined parts, troubleshooting equipment nobody else wanted to touch. His badge read contractor. New hires assumed he was somewhere between a mechanic and a ghost, a man who appeared before anyone else arrived and vanished before the after-work drinks began. None of them knew that 4 years earlier, in the worst months of his grief, Dean had walked into a board meeting and asked the company to hire someone else to run it. That was the last time most of that room ever saw the founder's face. The person he handed the company to was Vanessa Sinclair. She arrived with a resume built for magazine covers, a talent for growth numbers, and a story about herself she told so often it had started to feel true, even to people who knew better. Her mother had spent 30 years as a secretary for men who took credit for her ideas, and Vanessa had built her adult life around one private vow: she would never again be the person doing the work in a room where someone else stood at the podium. That hunger had once made her brilliant. Lately it had curdled into something closer to entitlement, a quiet conviction that the company Dean built was really hers because she was the only one anyone actually saw running it. When Dean stepped back, he did one thing almost no one understood. He placed his controlling shares into a family trust, the G.E. Foster Trust, named for his father, structured to protect Eli's inheritance no matter what happened to Dean. He named himself sole trustee. To a board exhausted from watching a grieving father fall apart, it looked like a man quietly stepping away. Nobody imagined he'd stay gone this long, and by the time Vanessa's tenure hardened into something resembling ownership, almost every board member who remembered the arrangement had retired, replaced one seat at a time by people she had personally recruited. Only one person on the entire floor still knew who Dean Foster really was. Ruth Bennett had worked in finance since the garage days back when payroll was done by hand, and Dean's father swept the floor himself at closing time. She never once called Dean anything but his first name, not even in private, because she understood a thing Dean was only beginning to learn the hard way: a secret survives only as long as the people who keep it treat it like one. The first signs arrived so quietly Dean almost let them pass. A framed photograph from the original garage, young Dean beside a welder named Tommy Reyes in front of their first machine, disappeared from the main lobby. Dean found it weeks later, face down in a box labeled archive, as though someone had run out of patience for a story that didn't center Vanessa. Around the same time, the new employee orientation video stopped mentioning a founder at all. The apprenticeship program that had carried his father's name for years was quietly renamed the Sinclair Fellows Program. Dean told himself a photograph and a name were not the company itself. He had made peace with being invisible a long time ago. That peace lasted until the quarterly operations meeting, when Vanessa proposed switching to a titanium supplier 18% cheaper than their current vendor. The catch, buried 3 slides deep, was that the new material lacked 2 of the durability certifications required for surgical implant components. Dean spoke up in a room where he almost never spoke, explaining as plainly as he could that a hairline fracture in the wrong part could fail inside a patient's body without warning. Vanessa let him finish. Then she smiled at the managers and said that Dean was, after all, only a machinery consultant, and that certifications like these were exactly the kind of legacy costs she was always having to justify to the board. A few people laughed because they were afraid of her. Others studied the table rather than meet Dean's eyes. Dean didn't argue. He opened his notebook and wrote a single word: drift. That night he asked the quality department to run an independent review of the new titanium. then sat alone studying a year of invoices Vanessa had personally approved. One name kept appearing, large enough to matter, small enough individually to escape notice. Meridian Advisory Group. $30,000 a month for consulting that produced no reports, no deliverables, and as far as Dean could find, no employees. When he traced the registration, the address led straight to Vanessa's younger brother, Julian Sinclair. The total already exceeded $1 million. This was no longer a woman erasing a man's name from a lobby wall. Someone was pulling money out of a company that still legally belonged to Dean and to his son. And the titanium decision suddenly looked less like bad judgment and more like a symptom of something being built underneath the company's foundation, one invoice at a time. Dean met Ruth privately and asked her to begin quietly preserving records. Original invoices, timesheets, vendor contracts, approval emails, market rate comparisons, everything with a date, a duplicate, and a location outside the company's own servers. Ruth didn't ask what he intended to do with it. She only asked how far back he wanted her to look. "Go back until we find the beginning," Dean said. They built it in a blue ledger that never once touched the company's network, Ruth's small kitchen, 2 streets over most nights after Eli was asleep. The ledger grew heavier every week. A warehouse the company paid rent on turned out when Ruth drove past it on a Saturday to be an empty lot behind a chain-link fence. Purchase orders approved outside the normal chain of signatures. Contracts priced just low enough to bleed the company slowly. Money moving through a string of shell companies that all seemed to end at the same family name. The clearest piece was an email Julian had written to his sister, a warning dressed up as reassurance: keep everything quiet until the trust is settled, because after that nothing else will matter. Then Ruth found a file that appeared on a shared drive for less than an hour before someone deleted it. She photographed every page first. It was labeled Project Crown, and it laid the whole thing bare. Vanessa was negotiating to sell the trust's controlling shares to an investment firm called Holloway Capital, presenting the trust to the buyers as an unmanaged asset left behind after a widow's death, ripe to be pressured into an undervalued sale. To make the company look worth rescuing at a discount, she was inflating fake expenses, signing contracts priced below profit, and preparing a mass layoff time to make Foster Precision look like it was dying. Only one piece stayed hidden, even from Ruth. She knew the trust was tied to Dean's family somehow, but not that he was the family that the quiet man in the canvas jacket owned the very shares Vanessa was trying to sell. Dean faced a choice. He could confront Vanessa publicly and immediately, but she controlled the servers, the narrative, and a board that barely remembered his name. A public accusation without ironclad proof would let her erase everything overnight and repaint him as a bitter contractor lashing out at a successful executive. Or he could keep being exactly what she believed him to be, harmless quiet beneath her notice. Dean chose silence, not surrender, the silence of a man building a case brick by brick, waiting for the moment Vanessa would least expect the ground to move. He brought in Margaret Boone, a calm, precise attorney who had handled small pieces of the trust's paperwork for years without ever knowing how large the stakes had become. She listened to everything, then told him plainly he was not ready to act. Vanessa had a legal team, control of every internal system, and a board that had mostly never heard Dean's real name. One misstep now and she'd frame him as the thief. Then Margaret asked a question that stayed with him longer than he expected. How many people currently on that board even know your name belongs to anyone other than a contractor on the shop floor? Dean did the math out loud slowly and realized the number was smaller than he'd let himself admit. This was not simply a matter of proving what Vanessa had done. It was proving who he was to people who had never known him as anything but invisible, with evidence so complete that no one in the room would have space left to doubt it. Margaret's caution proved justified faster than any of them expected. Within weeks, Vanessa noticed unusual activity in the company's older financial records, the quiet digital footprint of someone pulling files late at night. She ordered an audit of every finance department computer, restricted Ruth's access to several drives, and had security log anyone badging in after hours. The net was tightening long before they had enough to be safe from it. The first close call came on an ordinary evening when an IT technician arrived to inspect Ruth's workstation nearly an hour early, catching her mid-copy the last batch of files still moving onto a drive she kept hidden in her purse. Dean, watching the shop floor camera feed on his phone, deliberately triggered a fault in one of the production line motors. The alarm pulled the entire IT team away to troubleshoot it, and by the time they came back, Ruth was calmly typing an unrelated spreadsheet, everything else already closed. The second was sharper. Vanessa called Ruth into her office and, in a voice pitched somewhere between concern and threat, reminded her how easily a woman close to retirement could lose her pension over something as simple as removing documents without authorization. Ruth sat through all of it without blinking, thanked her for the reminder, walked back to her desk, and kept going. Fear only works, she told Dean later, on people who still believe they have something left to protect that matters more than doing the right thing. The investigation was not the only thing reshaping Dean's life. One Thursday, he nearly missed Eli's kindergarten dinosaur presentation because he'd been securing a backup that couldn't wait. He arrived breathless, still smelling of machine oil, to find Eli standing alone at the edge of the little stage, glancing again and again at the empty folding chair that was supposed to be his father's. On the drive home, Eli asked quietly whether the machines needed his father more than he did. Dean didn't have an answer ready, and the question sat in the car the rest of the way home, heavier than anything in the blue ledger. He recognized the shape of an old mistake trying to repeat itself, the same slow drift that had cost him months of Eli's early childhood after Grace died. Whatever he was building to protect his son's future could not come at the cost of his son's present. He pulled over before they reached the house and turned so Eli could see his face. He told his son that nothing in any building mattered more than the two of them, and that if he was ever late again, it wouldn't be because a machine needed him more, but because he was making sure no one could ever take away what belonged to their family. Eli considered this with the serious expression he saved for questions about dinosaurs and space, then asked if the bad machine had been fixed. Dean told him it had. The machine he meant had never been broken at all. Then the plan nearly ended before it began. Margaret called on an ordinary Tuesday. A courier had delivered a signed voting proxy to her office, a document declaring that the family trust had granted Vanessa Sinclair full authority to vote its controlling shares in favor of the Halloway sale. Dean's name was printed at the bottom beside a signature that looked at first glance exactly like his own. Dean told her he had never signed anything of the kind. She believed him before he finished because the document fell apart on inspection. The notary's license had expired over a year earlier. The date had been altered after the fact, the ink slightly wrong. And the signature had been produced with an old signature stamp, one that had sat untouched in the safe in the CEO's office since the day Dean stepped back. Dean remembered that stamp. He'd used it constantly in the years before Grace died, signing approvals so quickly a physical stamp had seemed like nothing more than a convenience. When he handed over the company, it stayed behind in the safe, a forgotten tool from a role no one expected him to need again. Vanessa had reached into that safe, found a piece of him she assumed was long forgotten, and used it to manufacture his voice, his authority, his signature, all to sell away the one thing meant to protect his son. Sitting across from Margaret with the forged proxy between them, Dean felt something shift in his chest that was different from anger. Colder, quieter. "Finish the case," he said, "and finish it faster than she expects." Michigan law let a person record a conversation they were part of without telling the other party. From that day, Dean carried a small recorder in the inner pocket of his jacket. It earned its place at the company's 15th anniversary celebration. Vanessa crossed the room to find him by the refreshment table, and in a tone that sounded almost gentle, told him she didn't hate him at all. "People like you," she said, "are built to construct the factory floor. People like me turn that floor into an empire." Then, not bothering to lower her voice, "You were never the brains of this operation. You were just the muscle we used for photographs." Dean said nothing. He let the words sit in the air, the recorder capturing every syllable, his face giving away nothing at all. His silence looked exactly like surrender, the quiet defeat of a man who finally understood his place. Vanessa walked away more confident than she'd been in months. She had no way of knowing those words would one day be played back to her in a room she could not walk out of. Ruth's next find confirmed how far Vanessa would go to make the sale look justified. A spreadsheet hidden inside an innocuous project code listed 60 employees scheduled for termination the moment the Halloway deal closed. Tommy Reyes, the welder from the garage photo, sat 11th on the list. A quality supervisor who'd raised concerns about the titanium had already been forced onto unpaid leave, his family's insurance set to lapse weeks before his daughter's surgery. Ruth printed the list and set it on the table without a word. When Dean reached Tommy's name, he set the page down and sat back, thinking of a man who had once stood beside him in a cold garage with borrowed tools and a shared belief that the work was worth doing right. A man now reduced to line 11 on a spreadsheet built to look leaner for a buyer who'd never heard his name. It was there, surrounded by that list, that Dean finally told Margaret something he'd never told anyone outside his family. 6 years earlier, long before Vanessa, the company had come within days of missing payroll for 200 employees. Dean had quietly sold several of his father's machines and taken a second mortgage on the house he shared with Grace to cover it, and never told a single employee where the money came from because he never wanted them to feel they owed him for keeping their jobs. Margaret's answer landed harder than she probably intended. That silence back then is exactly why Vanessa now believes you never carried any real weight here. A man who hides his sacrifices gets written out of his own story by people who never knew it happened. Dean sat with that a long moment. Humility, he realized, was never supposed to mean letting the truth be quietly deleted by someone else. Ruth's last piece of intelligence came days later. The confirmed closing schedule buried in an executive calendar. The signing was set for Friday at 5:00 p.m., 12th floor conference room, with funds to transfer the following Monday. For the first time since the investigation began, they had a date to work backward from, and Margaret began assembling everything. documents revoking the fraudulent proxy, proof the signature was forged, papers to convene an emergency board meeting the instant they had the votes, copies of the blue ledger secured off-site alongside files ready for law enforcement. And one more thing agreed between Dean and Ruth in that kitchen, spoken only once, so neither would forget it. When the day finally came, whichever way it came, Dean would call and he would say 4 words. Not an order Ruth could carry out alone. A signal. It meant send everything to everyone all at once. The board members they'd quietly identified. Margaret. The regulators. Let the case they'd built for 11 months do the rest. The plan was simple in outline and enormous in weight. Interrupt the transaction Friday morning before Vanessa realized how much they already knew. It lasted less than a day. Late Wednesday night, Vanessa traced unusual login activity back to Ruth's credentials and understood with the sharp clarity of someone who'd spent a year building a deception that Dean and Ruth were not loyal employees keeping busy. They were building a case against her. If she waited for Friday, they might beat her to it. So she moved before dawn, rather than wait for the scheduled closing. She called an all-staff meeting for 10 o'clock Thursday morning, gathering nearly 300 employees onto the main floor while a company camera crew streamed it live to remote offices. Standing at the front with the composed authority that had made her a favorite of business magazines, she announced that Dean Foster's consulting contract was terminated effective immediately. 2 security guards escorted him out within minutes, his badge deactivated before he reached the parking lot. He did not resist, did not raise his voice, did not look back at the 300 faces watching him go, though he felt every one of them on his back as the doors closed. In the same sweep, Ruth was suspended, her laptop and phone confiscated at her desk, while stunned co-workers watched from a careful distance. The finance office was locked, and Vanessa personally instructed Holloway Capital to move the signing up from Friday at 5 to that same afternoon 4:30, determined to close before anyone could interfere. She followed it with a company-wide warning: anyone caught sharing internal documents would face immediate legal action. For the first time, the plan was genuinely losing. Margaret, working frantically, found no realistic path to an emergency court order before the new signing time. The forged proxy was still sitting in Holloway's records as legitimate. The buyers had no reason yet to question it. Dean and Ruth had lost physical access to the building, where the remaining evidence lived, evidence that anyone loyal to Vanessa could still alter or delete before the day was out. Reclaiming the company after a completed sale could take years of litigation with no guarantee of winning. Everything Dean had built over 11 quiet months now hung on a handful of hours he had never planned for. Before the guards walked him out for what they clearly believed was the last time, Dean slipped into the archive room and took back the discarded photograph himself and Tommy Reyes in front of the first machine his father ever bought. He walked out the front doors into a hard, steady rain, pulled out his personal phone on the sidewalk and dialed Ruth from memory. When she answered, he said only 4 words, quiet and certain, in a way that surprised even him. Fire all of them. There was no anger in his voice, only the calm of a man who had waited 11 months for exactly this moment, and who finally understood that quiet patience has a limit. Ruth, who had already secured the final backup of the blue ledger somewhere far outside the company's reach, said only that she understood, and that she'd take care of her end. Then Dean asked her to have an old family friend, Mrs. Whitfield, pick Eli up from school. There was no telling how long the rest of the day would take. He checked the time. He had less than 6 hours to walk back into a building that had just erased his name from its badge system, unravel a transaction nearly a year in the making, and prove to a room full of strangers that the man they'd thrown into the street was never the trespasser at all. His father had lifted the first machine off a delivery truck with nothing but a pulley and stubborn patience. Grace had checked the first payroll by hand at their kitchen table. Tommy had welded through the night to finish orders no one thought they could make. None of them had ever needed a title to prove what they'd built. For 4 years, Dean had believed the same was true of him. Standing in the rain outside a building that no longer recognized his name, he understood that belief had never been wrong. It had simply run out of time to stay quiet. By 4:20, the 12th floor conference room was ready. Vanessa sat at the head of the table beside Julian, flanked by lawyers and 2 representatives from Holloway Capital, a stack of contracts marked "Sign Here" spread across the polished surface. She believed the only person who could still stop her had been thrown out that morning. For the first time in nearly a year, she let herself look almost relaxed. The elevator doors opened at 4:26. Dean stepped out in the jacket still soaked through, Margaret on his left with a case full of filings, Ruth on his right, carrying the blue ledger and a backup drive. 2 guards moved to block them, but one of them had been quietly kept on payroll by Dean himself through a rough year, and after a brief hesitation, both men stepped aside without a word. Vanessa ordered the guards to remove the disgruntled former contractor from her meeting. Instead, Margaret introduced herself as counsel for the G.E. Foster Trust and asked everyone at the table to stop signing. Vanessa assumed she'd come to finalize the sale, still certain the trust was overseen by passive lawyers with no real stake. Margaret placed the forged proxy on the table and walked through it, One flaw at a time: the expired notary, the altered date, the signature stamp pulled from a safe that hadn't been opened in years. Then she said the sentence that changed everything in the room. Dean Foster is the founder of Foster Precision Group, the sole trustee of the G.E. Foster Trust, and the owner of 62% of this company. He stepped back from daily operations 4 years ago to raise his son. He never at any point gave up ownership of what he built. The man Vanessa had fired that morning was not a bitter contractor. He was the owner of the very shares she was trying to sell. The Holloway representatives began quietly closing their folders. But Vanessa wasn't finished. She accused Dean of abandoning the company, of hiding his ownership for years, of vanishing from every meeting while she alone carried it forward, reappearing only now that it was valuable again. Dean let her finish. Then he asked Ruth to open the ledger. She laid it across the table. Invoices from a shell company for services that never existed. A warehouse rented for a lot full of weeds. Money moving quietly toward Julian's accounts. Contracts priced to guarantee losses. And the termination list: 60 names, Tommy's 11th, beside Julian's own email promising his sister that nothing would matter once the trust was settled. Vanessa called it a convenient story assembled by resentful employees with an axe to grind. So Dean asked Margaret to play the recording. His own voice came first. Then Vanessa's followed, calm and certain, in a way that made 2 board members visibly flinch. "You were never the brains of this operation. You were just the muscle we used for photographs." Dean looked directly at her across the table. "You got one thing right," he said. "The muscle is what kept this company standing while you quietly loosened every bolt underneath it." The Holloway representatives closed their folders for good and announced they were withdrawing, citing misleading information and clear signs of fraudulent ownership documents. Project Crown collapsed in the very room it was designed to fool. Vanessa tried once more, suggesting they handle it all quietly to protect the company's reputation. Dean answered simply, "You had 11 months to fix things quietly. Instead, you spent them renting my signature." That same evening, the board reviewed every page Ruth had gathered and voted to remove Vanessa for cause. And this is where 4 words spoken into a phone in the rain finally meant what they'd always meant. Ruth had already sent everything to everyone all at once. By nightfall, the terminations were signed not out of anger, only following through on what had already been proven true. Julian, the procurement director, the manager who ran the Meridian contract, the communications lead, the branding director, and the executive who'd helped bury the deleted files. Every name carried a date and evidence behind it. Fire all of them. It had never been an order Ruth could carry out from a suspended desk. It was a signal, and by the end of the day it had come true, just not the way anyone in that room had first heard it. Vanessa left the building that night carrying an empty box, the same kind she had handed to Dean that morning. Walking through the lobby, she passed the garage photograph already rehung, showing Dean and Tommy Reyes beside their first machine. No one mocked, no one clapped. Employees who had watched her cross that lobby with confidence for years simply returned to their desks. She walked out into the same steady rain that had soaked Dean that morning, and the doors closed behind her the way they had closed behind him hours earlier. The legal consequences moved quickly. An independent audit confirmed millions funneled through shell companies over several years. Julian was arrested and began cooperating. Vanessa eventually pleaded to charges tied to fraud and falsified documents. Much of the diverted money was recovered, and she was barred from ever again holding an executive role at a publicly traded company. Her name quietly disappeared from the same magazine features that had once celebrated her rise. Foster Precision rebuilt fast. The list of 60 terminations was canceled entirely. Demoted employees were reinstated with back pay. The certified titanium supplier was restored. Ruth became chief financial officer. The apprenticeship program went back to carrying George Edward Foster's name. And Tommy Reyes was finally recognized publicly as one of the company's original founders. The morning the reinstatement letters went out, Ruth called Dean before he'd finished making breakfast. Tommy had cried reading his, she said, not over the job, but because after all these years, someone had finally written his name down as one of the people who built the place. Dean stood in his own kitchen holding the phone, watching Eli stack pancakes on his plate, and found he couldn't speak for a moment either. Dean accepted the role of chairman of the board but declined to return as full-time CEO. Asked why, he said the company needed a full-time leader and Eli needed a full-time father. And there was only one of those 2 jobs he couldn't hand to anyone else. That same night, before the handshakes in the boardroom had even finished, Dean left. It was almost pancake night. His son had no idea his father had just unraveled a $900 million deal, walked back into a building that had banned him that morning, and stopped a woman from stealing his own inheritance out from under him. Eli only asked if work had gone well. Dean sat beside him at the counter, still faintly smelling of rain, and said it had been one of the best days he could remember. Months later, Dean tracked down one of the machines he'd sold 6 years earlier to make payroll, an old lathe of his father's. He set it in the company lobby beneath the garage photograph next to a picture of Grace, checking numbers on the day she first believed in what he was building. A small plaque beside it read, "Every company is built by somebody's hands." The last scene was at the kitchen table on a quiet Sunday where Dean and Eli were building a small birdhouse. Eli measured each piece of wood twice, tilting his head the exact way Dean and his own father once had, entirely unaware he was repeating a habit passed down through 2 generations of men who built things with their hands. He asked if Dean had built the whole company by himself. Dean told him no. His grandfather built it with his hands. His mother built it with her mind. Tommy welded it together and Ruth kept the numbers honest, and many people built it at once. Eli turned a small nail over in his fingers and asked what his father's job had been in all of that. Dean held the last piece of wood steady while his son hammered in the final nail. "My job," he said, "was keeping it safe." The birdhouse came out slightly crooked, but it stood on its own, and Eli set it on the windowsill where he could see it every morning. Silence was never the same thing as absence. The greatest legacy a person leaves behind isn't the name attached to it, it's the way their child learns to live by everything they once quietly watched them do. This story is fiction, but the feeling at the center of it isn't. Every day, someone who does the real work gets treated like they're standing near the machines instead of holding them up, and the people loudest about their own importance are almost never the ones carrying the weight. So here's the question. If you'd been one of those 300 people on the floor that morning watching a quiet man carry his box out into the rain, would you have said something? Or would you have studied the table like everyone else? Tell me in the comments. And if this reminded you that quiet doesn't mean weak, that the people who never raise their voice are often the ones holding the most weight, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so the next story finds you the moment it drops.